Hi there, I'm Vincent Boss and I provide dating and self-improvement advice. And in today's podcast, we're going to be discussing why your ex is never coming back. I provide audio coaching for breakup recovery, trying to get an ex back, attracting someone new, and life coaching. Visit www.dateme.tips for more details. Please check your spam and junk folders if you are expecting an email from me. Check out my socials for extra content. The links are in the description. So now let's get back into today's podcast. And today we are discussing why your ex is never coming back. So if you have been dumped and want to try to get your ex back, you need to separate fact from fiction, fantasy from reality. In today's podcast, I'll be discussing 3 reasons why your ex is never coming back. So let's get straight into this, and point number 1 is they aren't the same. So the reason why I say your ex is never coming back is because your past relationship is gone. You're both changed forever. Yes, you can get back together with the person you once had a relationship with, but is that actually your ex? Because after everything that has happened, you will both now be different people. You have both now changed forever. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. If you were to reconnect and your ex is a bit different, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It could actually be a good change. Similarly with yourself, you need to be growing. If you are the same person that your ex dumped, then this new relationship will not work, because the newer relationship needs to be built on stronger foundations. So the fact that you would both have changed isn't actually going to be a bad element as long as you have both changed in the right way. Now, sadly, that can't be guaranteed, but what can be guaranteed is that you aren't the same people. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have a few of the similar traits that you once had before. It just means that fundamentally there has been a shift. Fundamentally, it can't be undone that you have gone through a breakup. So we have to consider what this actually means and what this actually looks like. But they aren't going to be the same. Neither are you. And therefore, when we speak about, can you get your ex back? Well, yes, you can reconnect with that person. But I would say your ex is never coming back, because the person that you think of, the person that you remember in your mind's eye, no longer exists in the same way that they did before. You might fantasize about getting back with your ex and having the time of your life like you did when you first met 10 years ago. But if you get back together, it's not going to be that person. If anything, it's going to be more similar to the person that dumped you in many ways, because that was a more recent version of your ex. But then we have all of the interim. How long were you broken up with? Was it 2 weeks? Was it 2 months? Was it 2 years? Depending on how long it has been, will certainly suggest how possible it is that they could be much different to the person that you even last knew, let alone the person you last enjoyed your relationship with. As I said, if your relationship was a long relationship and you look really far back to when you first met, well, that person has long gone. Could they become someone that you connect with really well again? Yes, they could. But you are different and they are different. So the fantasy you have of the person that you had a relationship with that was going really well, that person is no longer around. It doesn't mean you can't build a relationship on stronger foundations. It doesn't mean that you can't have a great new relationship again. But let's try and remove that thought of who your ex was, because it's not likely to be who they are right now. The breakup would have scarred you, it would have scarred them, and recovery is necessary. But how you both grow and what direction that you both grow in, well, that is hard to predict, and that is somewhat unknown. For you two to reconnect, you need to be growing in a similar direction and growing at a similar pace. If you grow in different ways, or if you grow at different speeds, then sadly, this isn't going to work, and you might not figure that out until you get to the meeting stage, let alone communicating, let alone going through no contact. And that is why sometimes people get all of the way through the process of reconnecting. They go through the no contact phase, they hear from their dumper. They go through communication, which seems quite good. They then meet, and then at that point, they start to realise that something isn't quite right. Something isn't the same, but sadly, it hasn't changed for the better. That sometimes can only be seen in person. Now, in other instances, you can figure this out much earlier, during the initial communication, or perhaps both people never get that chance due to the fact that the dumper or the dumpee, if they receive that first message, don't feel the communication is even appropriate now because of how their feelings have changed. But when we speak about in point number 1, about why your ex is never coming back, I would suggest it's because they're no longer the same person. So are they really even your ex? So now let's get into point number 2 and the second point of today's podcast. Please like this video if you're watching on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. And point number 2 is half of you won't. So statistics vary from different sources, but generally it seems that about 50% of people don't get back together after a breakup. The stats do vary. They float around from 40 to 60% in either direction, and that can be depending on what source of research you actually look up and read. However, this means that on average that is 50%. Let's just call it that. Now obviously that means that half of you will get back together. So this can be seen as a glass half full or a glass half empty. But as already mentioned, they are not the same person that you were in a relationship with before. So when we consider these stats, we can look at it in a positive way and say half of you will get your ex back, but we can also look at it in the negative and say, well, half of you won't. And even if you do get them back, they're not likely to be the same person that you remember, for good or for bad. And this is the running theme of today's podcast. It isn't necessarily a bad thing that you can't get your ex back in exactly the same way that you remember them, because we want them to improve just as we want you to improve. We don't necessarily want our ex exactly as we remembered them. Maybe that glowing memory in our mind, we'd like them like that, but that's not likely to be, because so much time has passed. We want them to become a version 2.0 of themselves, just as we need to be that in our own mind as well. So when we consider point number 2 and we look at the stats and we think, right, 50% of us will, 50% of us won't, what makes the difference here? Well, generally, dumpees, from your perspective, it will be very much dependent on how you behave post-breakup. Now, we've already said that if you do get the chance to reconnect, it might not actually be in the way that you really want. It might not be the person that you really feel like you want to be with anymore. But putting that to one side and looking just at those stats, if you want to get your ex back, dumpees, you need to be doing everything you can to fall into that 50% that do. Because if you don't live your life in the right way post-breakup, as you can see, it's very easy to slip into that other half. No, we're talking very, very even odds. I'm saying 50-50. Like I said, you might read different research, 60-40, going in either direction. I've seen various pieces of information and they always bounce around in that area. Maybe they say 60% get their ex back, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%, and flipping around, obviously, the other way for those who don't get their ex back. So you can probably find your own info on this, but it always is around that. So we can see it's fine lines, and the differences between reconnecting and not is often very subtle, but depending on how you as a dumpee live your life post-breakup will certainly influence whether your ex-dumper feels that they want to reconnect with you. Now, it's not just all about them, because even if they do decide they want to reconnect with you, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. You might conclude that you don't want them back anymore, as already discussed, you don't have to take them back. So although we're talking about your ex-dumper having some level of power of deciding whether or not they want to reconnect, you also have the power of accepting that thought. Now, as a dumpy, I do not suggest in most instances you reach out to your ex unless they contact you first, but it doesn't mean that they wield all that power, because if and when they do, you have that position where you can think, right, do I reply? Don't I reply? What do I reply with? This is where you can hold that power again. Yes, they might have it right now, but we have to acknowledge they ended the relationship. It's their choice if they want to consider reconnecting. You can't persuade them. You can't force them. If they don't come to that decision themselves, well, there is no conversation to even be had. But if and when they do, that is when you as the dumpy come into your own and you can influence things hugely. So when we look at these stats, when we talk about why your ex is never coming back, when we consider that in an average sense from all of the research, we can say that 50% of you won't, I think it's a fair comment to make that even if you do reconnect and they're no longer the same person that you remember, they've changed somewhat, and then we can also say that half of you won't in any way, shape or form. I think it's a very fair comment to say that your ex is never coming back, because either they won't, 50% of you won't see that moment happen, but the other 50%, even if you do, well, they're not actually the person that you remember. Now, if you would like advice and support about how to try and increase the chance of one day getting your ex back, then you may want to consider my audio coaching service, where me and you can speak one-on-one about your unique specific situation. Go to my website www.dateme.tips for more information about how I can become your coach and your teammate via my audio coaching service. Talking about your feelings can also improve your mental health. It helps prevent the buildup of negative emotions, which can lead to stress, anxiety, depression, and even physical health issues. Speak your heart to free your mind. So now let's get into point number 3 and the final point of today's podcast. If you feel that this podcast has helped you, then please consider buying me a coffee. The link to do so is in the description. And point number 3 is because you said no. Now, it might sound ridiculous right now, but what I mentioned in point number 2 is really important for us to delve into, because there's actually a good chance that your ex could ask to return, but you turned them down. And like I said, I mentioned this in point number 2 very briefly, but let's just delve into that a little bit more, because you might be listening as a dumpy and thinking, well, that is insanity. That would never happen. Why are you mentioning this? I want my ex back. I would do anything to reconnect with them. I don't care what you say about stats. I don't care what you say about experiences. I am in my own bracket. Well, listen, dumpies, you might feel that you are unique in this position where you would do anything to get your ex back, but I would say that nearly all dumpies feel this way. And yet, by the time their ex-dumper tries to reconnect, which happens, as we've said, a good percentage of the time, you, as a dumpy, could easily have changed your mindset. And this can be due to a number of reasons. First of all, what you're going through right now is a combination of feelings very similar to grief and drug withdrawal. That's terrible. That's awful. That is agony. But you will get through this phase. Now, there's no time limit. I'm not saying it's going to be days, weeks, months, or years. It could be either of those possibilities. But when you do get through and you do become a stage 2 dumpy, and then beyond that a stage 3 dumpy, well, this is where you might start to change your mindset. When you are no longer feeling that pull due to that drug withdrawal effect, when you are not going through the hardest stages of grief and you start to work through grief, going through time and time again to the point where you're not feeling those worst stages pulling on you as much as they once did, well, you're going to see the world in a different way, in a way that you can't imagine right now. Because if you remove those 2 horrible thoughts in your mind, the drug withdrawal effect, going through those stages of grief, when you're not suffering in that way, you will see things differently. And that might still mean you want your ex back, but it also might mean that you don't. Becoming stage 2 dumpy is not based about time. It's about moving from a stage of thinking of your ex 24/7 to actually thinking of them a little less and possibly even considering dating new people. You still want your ex in stage 2, but you are happy to date other people and you are happy to live your life a little freer in your mind. Now, if and when you get to stage 3, which you will unless you get your ex back before, stage 3 is when you actually find someone that you deem better than your ex, which right now I imagine you would suggest is impossible. But there is the point. When people say time heals all wounds, I wouldn't necessarily say it heals the wounds, but it certainly makes you live your new normal a little easier. Actually, I would say a lot easier. So time is very, very important, but how much time you need will vary hugely. Some people start to feel better after a few months, maybe a few weeks is probably a bit unlikely, but a few months definitely, some people start to feel better. But that's not the norm. I would say much more likely you're going to be going through the grind for many months, a year or so, and beyond. I don't think it's totally unrealistic to say you could be suffering some level of symptoms a couple, maybe 3 years down the line. Now, that's not to scare you. It's not to say that you will go through that, but I've heard that plenty of times. And you should always remember that you can get that support. Whether you want to speak with a local doctor, friends and family to a certain degree can help you as well, a local counsellor, or maybe myself via my audio coaching service. Whoever you want to speak with, talking can help, and you will get through this phase. Now, this links into today's podcast about saying why your ex is never coming back, because more of you than you expect may be you listening right now who thinks that their ex is the only person they will ever want to be with. You might be the one who gets the chance of reconnecting, but actually says no. The reason why your ex will never come back is because you decide you don't want them anymore. You decide you want to find someone better. You decide you've already found someone better. And that is why when they do text you, you say thanks, but no thanks.